Well, I think thug is a compliment to Putin, or using the word thug as an insult to thugs by describing Putin is much, much worse than a thug. Putin is a psychopath. He is absolutely has no emotion when it comes to suffering of his people. It just doesn't even touch it. And as such, he's more in the category of a Stalin or a Hitler than, in some type of just garden variety kleptocrat. He's really in a whole category by himself in terms of the evil that he's able to inflict on his enemies, his neighbors, and his own people.
So we're approaching the 4-year anniversary of the full-scale invasion in February of Ukraine by Russia. And it was 3 years ago that you told me the war would escalate and get really nasty, and unfortunately it has. Where do you see this war going now?
Well, so the first thing I would say is that it's been the Putin's invasion has been a complete disaster and catastrophe for Russia. Not to mention Ukraine, but for Russia. They've lost, either through death or disability, 1.2 million young men, soldiers, in this invasion. And they've accumulated almost no incremental territory for those losses. And so it's really, I guess it lays bare this myth that Russia has this superpower status, that they have a military that's so amazing, and so on. It doesn't. Their military is corrupt, inept, and basically suicidal for anybody who's a part of it. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that it's effectively a frozen conflict. It's not frozen in terms of missiles and bombs and drones and so on fighting back and forth, but it's a frozen conflict in the sense that Russia's not making any significant territorial gains, and every effort that they make to try for those territorial gains just results in massive catastrophe and death for their people. They're losing 1,000 soldiers a day. So they keep on pushing, but they're not getting anywhere, and they're experiencing great losses on the battlefield. And so I would say that if we were to look into the future, people say, well, when's this war going to end? And the answer is, I don't believe it's going to end. I think that it will be redefined at some point when it'll be effectively a frozen conflict like other frozen conflicts in which nobody declares an end to the war, but there's nothing being gained from either side. The reason why it's not going to end is because Putin has to be at war for his own personal and political survival. He needs a war to distract the Russian people from his own failings as a leader. He doesn't want people to be mad at him. He wants them to be mad at a foreign enemy. He needs that to stay in power, and he needs to be in power in order to stay alive, because if it wasn't in power, the system would eat him up almost immediately, and he'd certainly be arrested, certainly impoverished, and probably killed. So Putin is going to carry on. And I can also say that the Ukrainians understand full well what will happen if Russia were to occupy their territory. If they were to say, we surrender, you can do what you want, then the basic model for that is Bucha. Bucha is a suburb of Kiev that was taken over for a short period of time after the initial invasion in February 2022. And in Bucha, all the women were raped, all the men were tortured and killed, and all the children were kidnapped. And so the Ukrainians understand that that's their fate if they were to surrender and allow Russia to occupy big parts of Ukraine. And so they're not going to surrender. And that leads us to this frozen conflict. And so the only thing that could happen, which would change the calculus, is if for some reason Europe decides that they no longer want to support Ukraine. And I should point out, when I mention Europe, I'm specifically not mentioning the United States, because the United States has already said they're not supporting Ukraine. But Europe is. So as long as Europe continues to support Ukraine, as long as Ukraine continues to get financial and military aid, they'll continue to be able to hold the line. And so that is where we are. There's not going to be any great peace deal done, negotiated by Donald Trump. There's not going to be a peace deal negotiated by Trump because Putin doesn't want to negotiate that peace deal. And so this will carry on, unfortunately.
The 1.23 million losses that Russia is suffering, or has suffered, how is Putin surviving that? How long can that go on for? Is there a method to that madness, those meat wave attacks?
The reason why Putin is doing it is that he believes that we're going to buckle before he does, that the West will fracture, that political leadership changes in the West, and when it does, there'll be a different opinion about supporting Ukraine. And he's been not wrong about that. Look at the United States of America. Under President Biden, it was, we're here until Ukraine succeeds. All of a sudden, Biden is not president. Trump comes in and says, we don't want to spend another penny on Ukraine. And so that's what Putin is betting on for the rest of the world. And he can bet on that because he's got this unbelievable capacity to stomach losses. So 1.2 million men would lead to a complete political disaster in a country that has politics. But Russia doesn't have politics. When I say it doesn't have politics, it means that there's nobody is going to elect somebody else. Putin is not going to lose his position in power. Why? Because Putin is not in a democratic country. Putin is in a totalitarian dictatorship. And why do the people put up with it? Because they have no choice. Right now, you either put up with it, or if you protest it, then you get arrested, tortured, and killed. So the average Russian says, there's no way out of this whole thing. We just have to suffer our losses and hope something changes in the future, but there's nothing that they're going to change on their own. And so he can carry on doing this for as long as he can. And that doesn't mean that the Russian people have infinite tolerance. There might be a moment in time when he does something which just enrages the people to such an extent that they rise up. But if they rise up, I think we can look at Iran as the model, which is that Putin wouldn't have any reservations about killing 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, even 100,000 of his own citizens, the way the Iranians have just done, if that was what he needed to do to stay in power. And so it's a very unpleasant situation for the average Russian, and it's certainly, of course, extremely unpleasant for the Ukrainians who are bearing the brunt of this psychotic madman.
Since 2024, Russia has gained 1.5% of Ukrainian territory, but they're ramping up the terror. So they have a goal of 1,000 drone attacks a day this year on Ukraine. Can Ukraine survive this bombardment?
Well, so this is Putin's big bet. He can't win on the battlefield, so he's going to try to demoralize and torture the average Ukrainian so that they no longer want to put up a fight. And the answer is, I don't think he'll succeed. I think he can do a lot of damage to Ukraine, as he's done. I mean, what's happening in Ukraine as we speak is unthinkable. It's freezing there. It's unbelievably cold. And he's knocking out power plants and heating plants so that the average Ukrainian person living in Kiev or Kharkiv or other places is literally freezing in their apartments. And it's hard to even imagine how pervasive that is. Every single person is subject to this. And being cold is really unpleasant. But the one thing that Putin doesn't have going for him is the seasons. We're sort of 5 or 6 weeks away from the cold to dissipate. And when the cold dissipates, then it will warm up and it won't be so torturous. And I don't know how the Ukrainians will solve this problem of all these drone attacks. I know that it's not, their suffering is not going unnoticed by Europe, and I know that the fixing of the infrastructure and defense of the skies is a super high priority for the West. And so all Ukraine needs to do is get through the next 5 weeks, and then we can think about, how do we prepare for next winter and what other methods and measures can be put in place. And I don't think the Ukrainians are going to give up because of this. But that's Putin's really his only hope. He can't win militarily on the battlefield, and so his only hope is to either demoralize the Ukrainians so they don't want to fight back, or to try to force some illegitimate political solution coming from President Trump to effectively surrender.
A big shift has been in terms of an oil war, so taking out the Shadow Fleet and deep strikes by Ukraine on Russian oil refineries. How effective is that?
The objective of all this is that if Putin runs out of money or doesn't have as much money, then he can't afford to pay as many soldiers, he can't afford to buy as much weaponry. He's got to also weigh up the balance between how much money does he spend on domestic needs versus military, because people will start grumbling, and if they're left really high and dry economically. And if we can somehow cut off that flow of money to Putin, it does put pressure on him, real pressure. And so we're arguing in the West about how to deal with the Shadow Fleet, how to deal with the Indian, Chinese, and Turkish oil refineries that buy the oil. But while we're sort of prevaricating and saying on one hand and on the other, Vladimir Zelensky is going out and sinking the Shadow Fleet tankers that are taking the oil. And I believe there's been about 5 that have been either destroyed or immobilized. And I'm sure for each of the ones that have been destroyed and immobilized, the other people who are sailing around with Russian oil are either doing so with great fear or maybe even not doing so. I'm also aware that some of the Western sanctions have affected some of the buyers of the Russian oil. And so, for example, some of the Indian oil refineries are now buying a lot less Russian oil. And as a result of that, there's a lot of Russian oil that's sitting in tankers offshore in India, even offshore in China. And the price of the Russian oil has dropped. And I understand it to be somewhere between $20 and $30 a barrel, which is painful, very painful for him. And so I think he's going to be suffering because of that. And if we can continue, both the Ukrainians and the West can continue to put pressure on Russia's oil export,